Rhythms of the Inner Life. For the past several weeks, we've been looking at several of the components of spiritual formation. And I would like us to end this series by taking a wider look at how spiritual formation can become a way of life. And let me start this way. Set it up with a question. I once heard a Christian brother ask this question. He said, what is the difference between a Christian with 10 years of growth and a Christian with 1 year of growth 10 times? Both have spent the same amount of time, 10 years. Both have had the same kind of experiences, but one of them found depth and growth during his 10 years. And the other didn't change, didn't grow, simply repeated life over and over and over again. It's like a quote I once heard. Brian McLaren said, faith is not an evacuation plan. It is a transformation plan. And what he meant was, it's not a ticket that we acquire at our baptism, and then we just put it in a safe place, and then we just cruise through life making no changes, and when we get to the end of life, we pull out our ticket to evacuate at the end of life. No, it's a transformation plan. At our conversion, at our birth, we begin. That's what birth means. It's a beginning. And through life, we change and we grow. And that transformation occurs throughout our entire life. And so in the case of the first Christian, this person had a vision and a plan for growth, and they consistently grew every year. They were not the same person after 10 years. The second Christian had no vision, no plan, and they simply repeated their life over and over. And this is why this is so important. Think of it this way. Picture our lives as having three parts, three components, three segments. There's the spiritual, the psychological, and the physical. The spiritual is our soul, our spirit, our faith, our conscience, our inner life, our ethics, our insight. The psychological is our mind, our will, our knowledge, thinking, emotion. And the physical, of course, is touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, sex. It's my body, it's my appetites. And the psychological and the physical, the mind and the body, they are designed to be under the leadership of the spiritual, under the control of the soul and the spirit that God is growing inside of me. The mind and the body need the leadership of our spirit. And without our spirit, our mind will begin to reach selfish conclusions, make hurtful decisions. And without the morality of the spirit and the good judgment of the mind, the physical, left to itself, will give in to appetites. It will grow out of control. But with the Spirit in charge, we have balance. Now, let's redraw this picture now. And what has changed? All three segments are now the same size, which means they are in competition with each other. They're competing for control. The spiritual is clearly not leading, and so it is weakened. As Paul told Timothy, it has a form of godliness, but it's really denying its power. And because of that, the minds are now troubled. 2 Timothy, Paul continued to say, always learning, the mind is always learning, but never able to acknowledge the truth because it needs the spiritual to give it the truth. It needs the leadership of the Spirit. And the physical, well, it's growing as well. And Paul goes on to say, loaded down with evil desires. The physical is growing. It's not being led. It needs the morality of a strong spirit, and it needs the wisdom of a disciplined mind. Now, let's draw it one more time. This is a corrupt life, and you'll see why. What has changed? The physical is now clearly in charge, and chaos is erupting. Isaiah said about the spiritual, it's seared. Woe to you who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. The spiritual is now seared over. It doesn't know what's right or wrong. And so it cannot provide the leadership of the psychological and the physical. And so the psychological now, the mind is now irrational. Jeremiah 5:21, you foolish and senseless people who have eyes but can't see. You have ears but you can't hear. Not thinking straight. And the physical is in control. As Jude 4 says, they are godless men who change the grace of our God into a license for immorality. God is completely out of the picture, and the appetites and chaos is in control. The point of all this is that when my spirit that God is growing in me is in control, my life is imbalanced. And so, what is my major goal? It's to keep the spiritual in control. And to do that, it must be fed. Some time ago, I found this picture. It's picturing a mature leaf from a mature tree talking to a young seed. And when I see the picture, I wonder what they're talking about. What is the leaf telling the seed? What happens when a seed grows up and matures? What does it become? It becomes a mature tree. It does not become a bigger seed. No, it completely changes. It becomes something completely different. And I love this illustration because it pictures what spiritual formation is. Let's think about spiritual formation. In fact, let's just take that phrase, spiritual formation, and take it apart. Spirit. It comes from the word pneuma, meaning breath, wind, spirit. The human soul. It's what animates the body. It's the power to know and to decide and to act. It's the only part of us that does not decay and die. It continually grows throughout our lifetime. And the goal is for us to step over the threshold at our death into a life that is pure spirit. And so, as Proverbs 20 says, the lamp of the Lord searches the spirit of a man. It searches out his inmost being. Or there is Ecclesiastes chapter 12. The dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Or there's 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Who among men knows the thoughts of a man except the man's spirit within him? And not only the word spiritual, but let's think about the other phrase, form. Form is from the Greek word morpho, and it means to shape, to sculpt, to mold, to build. And so Galatians chapter 4, verse 19, my dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed within you. It's our word morpho. Or the book of Romans chapter 12. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed, morpho, by the renewing of your mind. And then 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. And we, with unveiled faces, all reflect the Lord's glory, are being transformed into His likeness. God is sculpting, forming, shaping my spirit. Spiritual formation takes place in solitude and in community and service. And so I want you to notice in the life of Jesus, we see Him modeling all of these. We see Jesus modeling solitude. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verse 35, early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where He prayed. We also see Him modeling community. The very first thing Jesus did when He landed on the earth and began ministry was choose a community of 12 that He would disciple and teach. In chapter 9 of Mark, it says it's Jesus and that group of 12, they left that place and passed through Galilee. And notice what it says. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because He was teaching His disciples. He was using community. Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes about the balance we need to find between solitude and community. He said, let him who cannot be alone beware of community. He will only do harm to himself and to the community. Alone you stood before God when He called you. Alone you had to answer that call. Alone you had to struggle and pray. But then he says a little bit later on that page, let him who is not in community beware of being alone. Into community you were called. The call was not meant for you alone. In the community of the called, you bear your cross, you struggle, you pray. And so we have first solitude, and then community, and then later Jesus also models service. Again in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 6. Calling the 12 to him, he began to send them out, 2 by 2, and gave them authority over impure spirits. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that house. They went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. And so we have these three. In watching Jesus, we see these important habits and practices and routines. We first see solitude, retreat, seclusion, time alone with God, stopping, pausing, stepping away, early in the morning, 40 days in the desert, looking for quiet, choosing silence. These were the habits of Jesus, seeking solitude. Of course, the second practice we see is community, choosing the 12, relationship, friendship, the fellowship of believers, love your neighbor as yourself, companionship, encouragement, community, partnership, the family of God. All were vital practices of Jesus. And then thirdly, service. We see him in ministry, healing lepers, talking to the Samaritan woman, helping, healing, teaching. He who with ears to hear, let him hear. Tax collectors, sinners, crowds, people. Jesus was always among them. And so Jesus teaches us these three, solitude and community and service, and spiritual formation takes place. We are sculpted. God uses these three to shape us. But let's think a little further now. Spiritual formation also does not happen quickly, neatly, or predictably. Why? Well, let me just say it another way. Spiritual formation is handcrafted. It's not mass-produced. Because you see, people are not things to be mass-produced. It's like this little chart that I found, things and people. Things are mass-produced, people are handcrafted. Things only react to conditions. People make choices. Things are measurable. People are immeasurable. Things have acquired value. People have intrinsic value. Things are temporary. People are forever. And then let me add one more. Spiritual formation is a process, not an event. It's not a book, it's not a retreat, it's not a class, it's not this class. It's God shaping a life. And how long does that take to shape a life? It takes years, decades, a lifetime. It helps me to think of it this way. Truth dawning on a person. You see, clarity comes over time. Truth deepens over time. And truth that dawns on a person is always more valuable than truth that's simply handed to them. And all we have to do is look at the lives of the people that God has been forming. Moses, David, Jonah, Joshua, Abraham, Noah, John the Baptist, Peter, Paul, Timothy, Jesus with the 12. They all took a long time, some of them their entire lifetime. It happened slowly and painfully and personally and individually, and it took decades and a lifetime. Now, we started with the question, how can we make spiritual formation a way of life? And now that we have kind of a working definition, I'd like to spend the rest of our time thinking about that very question. And let's start in Mark chapter 12. One of the teachers of the law came to Jesus and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important one of all?" And it was a common question. Which is the most important one? And there were a lot of answers in Jesus' day that had been offered to answer this question. What's the most important commandment? Here's some of the most popular answers that were given in his day. Isaiah 33, verse 15. Walk righteously, speak the truth, refuse extorted gain, refuse bribes, refuse to hear murder plots, will not consider evil. That was one that was offered as the most important commandment. Psalm 15 was offered. A blameless walk, a true heart, does his neighbor no wrong, despises evil, keeps his word, honest deeds and tongue, does not slur his fellow man, honors those who fear God, keeps his oath, is generous, does not exploit the innocent. Now there were others. There was a short one, Habakkuk 2, verse 4, living by faith. And then Isaiah 66 was offered as an answer. A humble heart, a contrite spirit, respects the word. And I'll give you one more, Micah 6, verse 8, to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. All of these were given as answers to what is the most important commandment. But the one that Jesus gave, the answer that he gave, was by far the most popular answer of his day. And Jesus said, the most important commandment is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And no one was surprised when Jesus gave this answer. It was the number one answer of his day. But everyone was surprised by what he said next. Essentially, what he said next was, you've only asked me one question, but I'm sorry, I can't just give you one answer. I have to give you two, because I can't talk about God without talking about people. They always go together. And it was then that he gave them an unsolicited second answer. He said, the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. No one saw that coming. No one expected that. When Matthew records this story, he adds these words in Matthew 22:40. Jesus says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. He's saying that everything God has communicated to his people can be wrapped up in these two commandments. That is stunning. That is amazing. And this is why Prestoncrest has chosen these two commandments as the basis for our vision statement: passion for God and compassion for people. And we've gone a step further. We have unpacked these two into three core values. And here are the core values. From the first commandment, we could say our first priority is God. And my passion reaches up to God, to Him. He's my fuel, my salvation, my source of life. All that I do and all that I am depends upon my relationship with Him. Compassion for people. Love your neighbor. A second core value, we have two kinds of neighbors. One kind of neighbor already knows God. And so one neighbor is in the body of Christ, and my compassion reaches in to my spiritual brothers and sisters. I follow Jesus by caring for other Christians. And then the other neighbor does not know the way of Jesus, and I reach out to them in compassion. A life with Jesus is a missionary. A life without Jesus is a mission field. So we have reaching up and reaching in and reaching out as our core values. This is the connection between spiritual formation and the rest of our life. Now let me explain it a little further. I found it particularly helpful to picture these core values, these three values, in the shape of a triangle. Reaching up is at the bottom because it holds everything up. It is the foundation. It supports everything else. And this is the spiritual formation. This is God's work in my life and in your life. Reaching in is my community, my family, my church. And I want you to see how this is connected. Reaching in is connected to reaching up. The Apostle John used a phrase 2 times in his writings, and he's the only writer to ever use it this way. And he connects reaching up and reaching in. In his gospel, he put it this way. He said, "No one has ever seen God." That's the phrase that he uses. "But the one and only Son has made him known." He is saying that Jesus embodies God. We could look at Jesus and listen to what he says and what he does and how he thinks, and we see God. He embodies him. God incarnate. But there has never been a single individual since Jesus who by themselves could completely represent God. And so John says in John 1, no one has ever seen God, but Jesus makes him known. But in his letter, he said, no one has ever seen God, but if we love each other, God lives in us. You see what he's saying? Jesus by himself can display who God is. But all of us as a body of Christians, it takes us loving each other, and we can display who God is. That is the connection between reaching up and reaching in. Reaching up is our relationship with God, shaping our soul, changing our heart, forming our spirit, giving us a spiritual family, which is reaching in. And all of this prepares us for reaching out to our community. And here are the relationships. We have a relationship with God, we have a relationship with Christians, and we have a relationship with non-Christians. Those are all our relationships. I can't think of any other relationships that I have on planet Earth except with God, with those who know God, and those who don't know God. And we can describe this in so many different ways. Here are just a few ways that we can describe this. We can say that we have 3 kinds of relationships: with God, with Christians, and with non-Christians. We could say we have 3 areas of work: to establish faith, to develop faith, and to extend faith. We could say we have 3 focal points for life: worship, fellowship, and ministry. We could say we have 3 spiritual goals: to experience God, to discover our gifts in the body, and to use those gifts to serve. We could say we have 3 essential experiences: the presence of God, the atmosphere of the church, and the pain of our world. And finally, we could say there are 3 new norms that we live by: surrendering control to God, inviting evaluation by our brothers and sisters, and offering love to the world. These are just ways of describing the 3 faces of faith. Now, let's go back to our question, spiritual formation as a way of life. I want you to notice that there is movement in spiritual formation. There's a flow from the inner life to the outer life. Think back to Jesus' 2 commandments: loving God and loving our neighbor. Loving God flows into loving a neighbor. Passion for God empowers us to have compassion for people. Reaching up feeds reaching in and reaching out. And all that reaching up means My inner life, prayer, worship, quiet time, Bible reading, meditation, and a host of other inner life practices. They flow into and they empower all of my Christian relationships: fellowship, worship service, small groups, prayer partners, body life, accountability. And all of these in turn help me with reaching out, sharing my faith, service, justice, generosity, helping the poor, serving the homeless. Spiritual formation is fueling, it's funding, if we could say it that way. It's empowering our lives. It is becoming a way of life. Now, let's go a step further. Spiritual formation, we can see biblical examples of this flow and this movement. Here's some examples from the New Testament letters and from one of the Gospels, and I want you to notice the flow. Forgive as the Lord forgave you, Colossians 3. We are forgiven by God, and so that flows over, and now we forgive people in the body and outside the body of Christ. Or 2 Corinthians 13, praise be to the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort. And so we are receiving comfort from God. That is the inner life, that is upreach, and we're giving it to others. We're giving to inreach and outreach, to those in the body and out of the body. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 6, you welcomed the message, and then the message rang out from you. In other words, we are taught by God, and now we have something to say, to teach other people. And let me give you three more. 2 Corinthians 5:18. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So we are reconciled, and so we begin the process of reconciling ourselves to those in and out of Christ's body. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10. I love this. Faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. God made us administrators of his grace. He said, here's my grace, go administer it to people. We receive grace, and now we extend it. And finally, John 13, verse 14, now that I, your teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. We are served by God on a daily basis. I heard someone say that every day God feeds 7.5 billion ungrateful people. He serves us. And so in turn, we go out and serve people. This is the movement of spiritual formation. We're forgiven, comforted, taught, reconciled. We receive grace, we're served, and then we extend that on to people. And God blesses us, and then we extend that blessing. He feeds and fills us, and that overflows in our ministry to other people. Our inner life moves over and flows into our outer life. Spiritual formation becomes a way of life. Now, spiritual formation is often thought of as a highly personal matter, God forming a person's spirit. And it is highly personal. But God also uses relationships within the church to shape and change who we are. In fact, I want you to consider all the relationship levels that exist simply in our own church here. Think of these. Our largest level of relationship is our Sunday worship service. We could call it people to people. It's an inspirational level. It's worship. Hundreds of Christians praising God together, sharing communion, being taught and motivated by the preaching of God's Word. But still, there are some things that can't be done in a gathering this large. And so, we have a smaller gathering. We could call it face-to-face. It's our Bible classes. And in our Bible classes, we can cover a much broader field of study and spiritual topics. Dozens of topics are discussed and studied every single Sunday. Not to mention the way we keep in touch with each other. Before class, after class, in the foyer, we're taking care of each other. But still, many classes are quite large. And so we have another even smaller level of relationships, our small groups. And this takes us all over the metroplex, where each group has the flexibility of both time and place, all in the warmth of a home, where most of our groups actually meet. Another level we could call simply neighbor to neighbor. It's not necessarily smaller, but it draws from all the relationship levels, and this service level provides the opportunity to serve our community, to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. But there are some smaller levels that we need to see. In fact, spirit to spirit is a much smaller discipleship level. And here we step even deeper into spiritual formation territory. As Christians study together, reflect together, discuss, and begin to practice the spiritual disciplines. Now let me ask you, what is the smallest actual group that can exist? How many people? 2 people. Heart to heart. Very personal. The deepest level of safety, the deepest level of trust. It is here that confession can take place. One Christian entrusting themselves to another Christian. A beautiful place of spiritual and sacred companionship. Now, all these relationship levels touch the spirit. They feed our inner life in different ways. And they work together. They actually need each other. But here's my question. What drives them all? What empowers them all? The most important relationship, the one that sits at the bottom holding them up, the one that drives all the others, is potter to clay. You remember old hymn, mold me and make me after your will, while I'm waiting, yielded and still. This is the most important level, private, personal, me in my closet with God alone. Because it provides me with the power and the energy and the fuel and the motivation for all the other levels. Potter to clay. Now, it's been my experience that we easily can give our time and attention to levels 1 and 2. People to people, the inspirational level, and face to face, the instructional level. Coming to worship service, going to our Bible classes. And more than this, some churches have introduced this third level of small group ministry. We have done that in a big way. And some are making great strides in using their community to serve the people in the community, and even using smaller groups to think and to share and discuss the inner life together. And some have even found that special Christian friend, that safe relationship, that safe conversation where accountability can begin to happen. But it's the bottom level that I want us to think about, because I cannot practice the second commandment unless the first commandment is deeply rooted in my heart. I can't practice it. I can't practice any of the top 6 relationship levels without that private level, potter to clay, God shaping me firmly in my life and growing. Perhaps you heard this popular phrase, do your best and God will do the rest. It sounds nice enough, but I want you to think about it. When my life is divided into my best and God's rest, when will I actually go to God? When will I determine that I need Him? Do you see a problem here? God is becoming a last resort. The potter to clay is a last resort. We work through all the levels fine, but what about that one that should be driving it? Well, I'll call you, God, when I run into a problem and need you. I go to God when all of my own resources are depleted. This is not discipleship. Discipleship does not mean I go to God when I can no longer function on my own. On the contrary, it means that I confess that I have nothing at all unless I have received it from God. You see, Paul did not write to the Philippians and say, I can do most things myself. No, he said, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me, gives me the strength. Our relationship with God feeds our relationships with each other. Our compassion comes from our passion for God. Our ministry energy will come from our relationship with God. Solitude, being alone with God, quiet, silence, will shape and train me to know how to be in community and in fellowship and in relationships and in ministry. One time Jesus said, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I want you to look at that last phrase. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. I wonder, do we believe this? Do we believe that the way of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the style of Jesus is easy? Do we think His way of living is light? I think if faith is a religious hobby, if I just dabble in it, if it's part-time, it will always be difficult. It will always be a burden. But if I give myself to it, if I give myself to compassion, over time, compassion becomes more of who I am. If I give myself to forgiveness, if I give myself to patience and kindness, if I give myself to generosity, if I give myself to perseverance, not dabble in it, but give myself to it. What happens when you do something repeatedly? You get better at it. Ask anyone in sports, ask anyone in education, ask anyone acquiring a skill. We get better at what we repeatedly do. It will become our way of life. And over time, the way of Jesus will become who we are. This is why reaching up is the foundation for everything else. It holds it all up. And this is how and where we start. I truly hope that you have benefited and enjoyed this class, Rhythms of the Inner Life. I think I can speak for myself and Robert Stolte and all of those brothers who volunteered and taught in this series. We can say that we enjoyed this time very much. May God bless you in your spiritual journey.